He took everything, Jessica whispered, her voice breaking as she stared at the empty spaces where our electronics used to be. I'm Toby Jackson, and I had just returned from celebrating my wedding anniversary to find that my best friend Jake Wells had robbed us blind. The man I'd known for 20 years had waited for us to leave town and then appeared to methodically remove valuables from our home. But what I discovered next made the theft seem like nothing compared to the deeper violation he had planned. To understand how devastating this betrayal truly was, you need to know who Jake Wells was to me. Jake Wells wasn't just my friend, he was my brother in every way that mattered. We met in college 20 years ago, when he was the guy who'd lend you his last $5 without asking when you'd pay it back. While other friendships faded after graduation, Jake stayed constant. When my father died suddenly of a heart attack, Jake drove 8 hours through the night to be at the funeral. He didn't just show up. He stayed for 3 days, helping me sort through paperwork and making sure I ate something. That was Jake, always thinking about what you needed before you knew you needed it. The man had built something real in our town. Wells Construction started as a one-man operation working weekends while Jake held down a regular job. By his 30s, he was employing 12 people and had a reputation for honest work at fair prices. The city council asked his opinion on development projects. The local newspaper interviewed him about the housing market. Jake Wells was somebody people respected and trusted. When I lost my job at the insurance company, Jake showed up at my door with a toolbox and a proposition. "Come work with me until you figure out what's next," he said. No questions about my qualifications, no concerns about mixing friendship with business. For 6 months I swung hammers and learned how to install drywall while Jake covered my family's health insurance through his company plan. The day I got hired at the bank, Jake threw a barbecue to celebrate. 3 years later, when Jessica's pregnancy went sideways and she ended up on bed rest for 2 months, Jake organized everything. He coordinated meal deliveries from our church. He picked up our older kids from school when I had to stay late at work. The night Jessica went into premature labor, Jake was the one watching our children so I could rush to the hospital. Our son Michael wouldn't exist without Jake's steady presence during those terrifying weeks. That's why when Jake's world started falling apart, I never questioned helping him. His business had grown too fast, taking on projects that required more cash flow than he could manage. The accountant he'd trusted for years had given him advice that sounded reasonable, but turned out to be creative tax strategies that crossed legal lines. When the IRS came knocking, Jake owed $200,000 in back taxes and penalties. The tax evasion conviction carried an 18-month sentence. I visited Jake every other week during his time in minimum security prison, watching him work in the kitchen and attend mandatory financial management classes. He read voraciously, devouring books about starting over and rebuilding credit. Every phone call ended with Jake apologizing for being a burden and promising things would be different when he got out. The day of his release, I drove 4 hours to pick him up from the federal facility. Jake looked smaller somehow, wearing the same clothes he'd worn to sentencing a year and a half earlier. The drive home was quiet, until Jake broke down crying about losing everything: his kids, his marriage, his reputation. "I just want to prove I'm not the person who made those mistakes," he said, his voice raw with emotion. Jessica had reservations about Jake staying in our spare room. "He's been through trauma," she said carefully, "and people change when they're desperate. Are you sure this is safe for our family?" But she saw how important this was to me. Jake had been there for us during our worst moments, and I couldn't abandon him when he needed us most. Jake threw himself into being helpful from day one. He cooked breakfast for the kids every morning before school. He fixed the loose floorboard in our hallway that I'd been meaning to get to for months. Evenings found him reading stories to our youngest daughter or helping our teenage son with algebra homework. Within weeks, Jake had found part-time work at a local hardware store. The manager remembered Jake's reputation from before his troubles and was willing to give him a second chance. When our 15th wedding anniversary approached, Jake insisted we take a real vacation. "You two have been carrying everyone else's problems for too long," he said. "Let me handle things here for a weekend. You deserve time together." His enthusiasm about watching the house while we got away convinced us we'd earned some time alone. Jessica and I hadn't taken a real weekend away in 3 years. Between work schedules and 3 kids, there was always something: a soccer tournament or a school play, or one of the children coming down with a fever right when we made plans. But our 15th anniversary felt different. We were both 38, now old enough to know that time doesn't wait for convenient moments. The bed and breakfast in Asheville had been Jessica's choice. Magnolia Inn looked like something from a postcard with its wraparound porch and clawfoot tub, big enough for 2 people. "When's the last time we took a bath together?" Jessica had said, showing me her phone screen. I couldn't remember, and that felt like reason enough to book the weekend. Jake practically pushed us out the door that Friday morning. "You two have been married 15 years and you've never stayed at a proper romantic hotel," he said, while helping me load our overnight bags into the car. "I've got your spare key and I'll water Jessica's plants. You won't even know I was here, except everything will be cleaner when you get back." The children were spending the weekend with Jessica's parents across town. My mother-in-law had been planning activities for weeks, and everyone had something to look forward to. Jessica hesitated with her hand on the car door. "Are you sure you'll be okay here by yourself? We've never left the house empty for a whole weekend." It wasn't about Jake specifically. We were just homebodies who liked having control over our space. "I'll be the most boring house sitter in history," Jake promised. "I'll probably spend Saturday organizing your garage and Sunday reading on the back porch. Maybe I'll order pizza and watch baseball." That Thursday night before we left, Jake had shown me his resume for a full-time position at a local construction company. "I think I have a real shot at this job," he'd said. "The foreman knows my reputation from before, and he's willing to look past the legal trouble. If I get this position, I can start saving for my own place and maybe see my kids again." The drive to Asheville felt like stepping into a different life. Jessica put her hand on my knee as we left the city limits, and I realized how long it had been since we'd touched casually, without one of the children demanding attention. We talked about everything except Home, the new album Jessica had been listening to, the book I'd been reading, the vacation we wanted to take when our youngest graduated high school. Magnolia Inn exceeded our expectations. Our room had exposed brick walls and windows that looked out over gardens, where hummingbirds darted between flowers. The owner greeted us personally and explained the history of the building while showing us to our room. Jessica immediately took photos of the antique furniture and the view from our window. Saturday morning we slept until 9, something that hadn't happened in years. We ordered room service breakfast and ate it in bed, reading sections of the newspaper aloud to each other. Jessica wore the silk nightgown she'd bought specifically for this trip, and I realized I'd forgotten what she looked like when she wasn't rushing to get ready for work or helping children with homework. That afternoon, while we walked through downtown Asheville, looking at art galleries and antique shops, I thought about Jake, probably reading in our backyard or working on some project to surprise us. "He's probably enjoying the peace and quiet," Jessica said when I mentioned wondering what he was doing. "No kids asking him questions every 5 minutes." Sunday morning came too quickly. We packed slowly, both of us reluctant to return to the demands of regular life. Jessica folded her silk nightgown carefully, placing it in tissue paper, like she was preserving something precious. "We should do this more often," she said, but we both knew it would probably be another few years before we managed another weekend away. As we loaded our bags into the car, I wondered if we'd ever feel that carefree again. The drive home felt shorter than the trip up, and soon, we were pulling into our familiar neighborhood, watching the sun set behind the houses we'd known for years. The driveway stood empty when we turned onto our street. My heart started beating faster as I noticed Jake's car wasn't there, though I told myself he'd probably just stepped out for groceries or a walk. The house looked exactly as we'd left it, the same white siding and red front door, but something felt wrong the moment I cut the engine. Jessica gathered her purse and our Asheville souvenirs while I pulled the suitcases from the trunk. The front door was locked, which made sense, but the silence that greeted us when I turned the key was different from normal quiet. This was the hollow silence of abandonment. "Jake," I called out as we stepped inside. "We're back." No answer. Jessica set down her purse and looked around the living room. "Maybe he's taking a nap," she said, but uncertainty crept into her voice. I walked toward the back of the house, calling Jake's name louder. The kitchen was clean, almost too clean, like someone had scrubbed away evidence. The coffee maker had been moved from its usual spot. Small details that might mean nothing but felt wrong somehow. Jake's temporary bedroom was at the end of the hallway. I knocked on the closed door and waited. Nothing. I opened it slowly, expecting to find Jake sleeping or reading. The room was empty. Not just empty of Jake, but empty of everything that belonged to him. The bed was made with military precision. The dresser drawers hung open and vacant. The closet door stood ajar, revealing nothing but wire hangers. "Toby!" Jessica's voice came from our bedroom, sharp with panic. I found her standing in front of her dresser, the top drawer pulled out completely. Her jewelry box sat open and empty, the red velvet compartments that had held her grandmother's pearl necklace and my 10th anniversary diamond earrings, now containing nothing but dust outlines, where precious things used to rest. We moved through the house like investigators cataloging losses. The flat-screen television from the living room was gone, leaving only the mounting bracket on the wall. Jessica's laptop that she'd left charging on the kitchen counter had vanished along with its power cord. The spare iPad we kept in the guest room was missing from the nightstand drawer. My hands shook as I dialed Jake's number, straight to voicemail. I tried again and got the same automated message. I sent a text asking where he was and if everything was okay. The message showed as delivered, but no response came. Jessica discovered her purse had been rifled through. The $60 in cash she'd left in her wallet was gone, along with the emergency credit card we kept hidden in a side pocket. "He went through my things," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He looked through my personal belongings while we were celebrating our anniversary." I called Jake's number again, then again. After the 5th attempt, the calls went directly to a message saying the number was no longer in service. Jake had disconnected his phone. That realization hit me like cold water. People don't disconnect their phones because of emergencies. They disconnect them when they don't want to be found. Jessica found the spare house key we'd given Jake sitting on the kitchen counter next to the salt and pepper shakers. It was placed deliberately in the exact center, like someone had positioned it carefully. Next to the key was a small piece of paper torn from a notepad. Nothing was written on it, but it had been folded in half and weighted down by the key, as if Jake had intended to write something and then changed his mind. We stood in our kitchen holding that key and staring at each other. Every room told the same story. Jake hadn't left in a hurry or because of some emergency. He'd packed methodically, taking only what was valuable and leaving behind anything that couldn't be easily converted to cash. "He planned this," Jessica said, the words hanging in the air between us. "From the beginning, he planned this." I wanted to argue with her to find some other explanation, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Jake Wells had robbed us blind, and I was going to have to make a decision I never thought I'd face. I stared at my phone for 20 minutes before dialing 911. Every part of me wanted to find another explanation for what had happened. Maybe Jake had some kind of emergency and took our things to pawn them for quick cash. Maybe he was planning to return everything and had just panicked about something. But Jessica's empty jewelry box stared back at me from the dresser, and I knew I was making excuses for someone who had betrayed us completely. "We've been robbed," I told the dispatcher. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth. Robbed implied strangers breaking in through windows or picking locks. What we'd experienced felt more personal, more calculated. The person who did it was staying in our home as our guest. Officer Martinez arrived first, followed by Detective Sullivan 20 minutes later. They walked through our house taking notes and photographs while Jessica and I followed behind, pointing out everything that was missing. Detective Sullivan had gray hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen this exact scenario many times before. "House guest theft," he said matter-of-factly while examining the empty space where our television had been mounted. "That's when invited guests abuse hospitality to systematically steal from their hosts. We see it more often than you'd think. Someone earns your trust, gets familiar with your routines and your belongings, then takes advantage when you're away. Is your friend recently out of prison by any chance?" The question hit me like a slap. Yes, but that's not why he... I started to defend Jake, then stopped. Everything Detective Sullivan was describing matched our situation perfectly. Jessica had to describe her missing jewelry piece by piece for the police report. Her grandmother's pearl necklace with the diamond clasp. The sapphire earrings my mother had given her when we got engaged. The tennis bracelet I'd bought for her 40th birthday last year. Watching her catalog these precious items reduced to descriptions for an insurance claim felt humiliating. These weren't just expensive objects, they were pieces of our family history. Detective Sullivan called the hardware store where Jake worked. The manager confirmed Jake had called in sick Friday morning, saying he had food poisoning and wouldn't be in for the rest of the weekend. Jake had never been sick a day since he'd started working there. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. We'll check security cameras from businesses in your neighborhood, Detective Sullivan explained. Sometimes we get lucky and catch footage of the suspect loading stolen items into their vehicle. My calls to Jake went straight to a disconnected line. He'd cut off all communication permanently, not temporarily. This wasn't someone who'd made a mistake and was too ashamed to face us. This was someone who'd planned his disappearance. 3 days later, the detective called with devastating news. Jake's browser history from our computer showed he'd been researching pawn shops and online marketplaces during the week before our anniversary trip. He'd looked up the value of electronics and jewelry. He'd even created accounts on selling platforms using false names and temporary email addresses. The theft hadn't been a moment of weakness or financial panic. Jake had been planning to rob us from the moment we announced our weekend getaway. In cases like this, the perpetrator usually begins planning immediately after moving into the home, Detective Sullivan explained during our follow-up meeting. They study your routines, identify valuable items, and wait for the right opportunity. Your friend likely saw your kindness as weakness and your trust as an opportunity. The timeline the police reconstructed was devastating. Jake had withdrawn his remaining funds the day before our trip and closed his bank account with no forwarding address. Security footage from the gas station 2 blocks away showed him making multiple calm, methodical trips to load boxes into his car Saturday afternoon. This wasn't someone acting on impulse. Jake was executing a plan. We see this pattern about twice a month, Detective Sullivan said. Recently released individuals who exploit the trust of friends and family members trying to help them get back on their feet. The recidivism rate for this type of crime is unfortunately very high. 20 years of friendship had been reduced to case number 2019-4471 in the police department's filing system. The man I'd considered a brother had studied our family like a target, calculating exactly how much trust he needed to earn before he could destroy it. But as we drove home from the police station, I had no idea how deeply this violation would change everything about our daily lives. Jessica started checking the locks every night before bed. Not just the front door, but every window latch, every sliding door, every possible entry point into our home. I'd hear her footsteps moving through the house at 11 o'clock, then again, at midnight, making sure everything was secure. When I asked her about it, she said she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us planning their next move. He lived here for 6 weeks, she said. He knows our routines better than we do. The sound of our garage door opening made both of us jump now. Before Jake's betrayal, I'd never noticed how loud it was, or how it echoed through the house. Now, every unexpected noise sent Jessica to the window to check who was in our driveway. She'd developed this habit of peering through the blinds whenever she heard footsteps on our front porch. While cleaning out the guest room, Jessica found something that made everything worse. Hidden under the mattress were our tax returns along with photocopies of our bank statements and credit card bills. Jake had been going through our personal paperwork, photographing documents, and studying our financial information. He knew exactly how much money we had in savings and what our monthly expenses looked like. The violation felt deeper than theft. Jake had been preparing to steal our identities along with our possessions. Our youngest daughter, Emma, asked about Uncle Jake every day for 2 weeks. "When is he coming back?" she'd say during breakfast. "I want to show him the picture I drew at school." Jessica and I had agreed to tell the children that Jake had found his own apartment and moved out, but Emma wasn't satisfied with that explanation. She'd grown attached to Jake's bedtime stories and his Saturday morning pancakes. Why didn't he say goodbye? She asked. I didn't have an answer that would make sense to a 7-year-old. The insurance adjuster treated us like we were trying to scam the company, questioning why we'd given a house key to someone with a criminal record and suggesting we were partially responsible for what had happened. I replayed every conversation I'd had with Jake during his 6 weeks in our home. Had I missed something? Were there warning signs I'd ignored because I wanted to believe my friend was getting his life back together? Jake had asked casual questions about our work schedules and our anniversary plans. At the time, his interest seemed caring, but now I wondered if he'd been gathering intelligence. He'd complimented Jessica's jewelry and asked about the electronics in our home entertainment system. I'd thought he was making conversation, but he'd been taking inventory. Telling our mutual friends about Jake's theft felt like admitting I'd been a fool. Mark Rodriguez, who'd known Jake since high school, refused to believe the story. There has to be some mistake, he said, when I explained what had happened. Jake would never do something like that. Maybe someone else broke in and took your stuff. Other friends asked uncomfortable questions about why we'd let Jake stay in our home without doing background checks or setting boundaries. Their judgment stung because part of me agreed with them. Every memory of Jake's behavior during his stay became suspect. His helpfulness around the house now seemed like reconnaissance. His interest in our daily routines felt calculated. The way he'd encouraged us to take our anniversary trip looked like manipulation. Had any of his gratitude been genuine, or was everything part of an elaborate performance designed to earn our trust? I couldn't tell the difference anymore between Jake's authentic moments and his deception. We started noticing things Jake had done that we'd overlooked at the time. He'd measured the television when we weren't looking, claiming he wanted to see if it would fit in his future apartment. He'd asked Jessica about her jewelry collection during a casual conversation about family heirlooms. He'd offered to help with household repairs that gave him access to different rooms in our house. Every act of kindness now felt like strategic positioning. The worst part was questioning whether the Jake I'd known for 20 years had ever really existed. Maybe the loyal friend who'd supported me through difficult times had been performing even then. Maybe his generosity and reliability had always been calculated investments in relationships he could exploit later. 20 years of shared history felt contaminated by the possibility that none of it had been real. I'd built my understanding of friendship and trust on a foundation that might have been lies from the very beginning. But sitting in our violated home surrounded by the wreckage of our trust, I realized something important. I wasn't going to let Jake disappear into the night with our belongings and our peace of mind. The police might consider this just another case file, but for me this was personal. I was going to find Jake Wells, and I was going to make sure he faced consequences for what he'd done to my family. Detective Sullivan warned me not to get my hopes up. These cases rarely result in recovery of stolen property, he said during our third meeting. Your friend has probably already sold everything and moved on to his next target. Even if we find him, prosecution is complicated because he was invited into your home. I understood the statistics, but I couldn't accept that Jake would just disappear with our belongings and face no consequences. Jessica and I started our own investigation that night. We pulled up Jake's social media accounts that we'd never thought to examine closely before. His Facebook profile claimed he'd graduated from State University with a business degree, but when Jessica called the registrar's office, they had no record of Jake Wells ever attending. His LinkedIn profile listed 3 previous employers who didn't exist when we Googled their business names. The construction company he claimed to have worked for before starting his own business had no record of employing anyone with his name. The lies went deeper than we'd imagined. Jake had told us his ex-wife moved to Phoenix with their children, but court records showed he'd never been married. The 2 kids he'd shown us pictures of belonged to his sister in California. She confirmed over the phone that Jake had been using photos of her children to create a fake family history. He's done this before, she said quietly. He tells people what they want to hear to gain their sympathy. Public records revealed Jake's real criminal history spanning multiple states. The tax evasion conviction was just his most recent crime. He'd been arrested for theft by deception and identity fraud in previous years. The pattern was always the same. Jake would befriend people going through difficult times, offer to help with their problems, then steal from them when they trusted him enough to let their guard down. His sister gave me contact information for Jake's previous victims. Maria Santos in Denver had let Jake stay in her home after he claimed to be recovering from cancer treatments. He'd stolen her late husband's tools and her mother's antique jewelry. Tom Bradley in Las Vegas had hired Jake to do construction work on his restaurant. Jake had taken advance payments for materials and never returned. Both victims described Jake as charming and helpful, right up until the moment he disappeared with their possessions. Jessica found something that made us both sick. Jake had been selling our belongings online using multiple fake accounts created with stolen identities. Our television was listed on Craigslist in Atlanta. Jessica's laptop appeared on Facebook Marketplace in Charlotte. Her grandmother's pearl necklace was being sold through an eBay account registered to someone named David Martinez who didn't exist. Jake had been moving from city to city selling our things while staying ahead of law enforcement. The legal complications Detective Sullivan had warned us about were real. Because Jake had been our invited guest, the theft charges were harder to prove than a typical burglary. His defense attorney could argue that we'd given him permission to use our belongings or that he'd borrowed items intending to return them. The prosecutor explained that house guest theft cases required extensive evidence to demonstrate criminal intent rather than misunderstanding. We provided everything we could find: screenshots of Jake's fake online selling accounts, phone records showing his disconnected number, bank statements proving he'd emptied his accounts before disappearing, the photocopies of our financial documents found under his mattress, Jessica's detailed inventory of missing jewelry with photographs and insurance appraisals. Slowly, we built a case that showed Jake's systematic planning and deception. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after Jake had robbed us. Police in Birmingham, Alabama, arrested him for attempting the same scheme on another family. Jake had convinced a recently divorced father to let him stay in the guest room while he got back on his feet after losing his job. The homeowner had become suspicious when Jake started asking detailed questions about his work schedule and began measuring furniture, claiming he was planning his future apartment layout. When several items went missing, the victim called police and caught Jake loading stolen electronics into his car. Detective Sullivan called us with the news. "We've got him," he said. "Birmingham PD found some of your belongings in his possession, along with fake identification documents and detailed notes about his next target." They'd recovered Jessica's sapphire earrings and my father's watch, but most of our things had already been sold. Jake had been carrying a notebook with information about 6 different families he was planning to victimize in 3 different states. The court proceedings revealed Jake's complete lack of remorse. He sat in the defendant's chair, wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking bored, while the prosecutor read the charges against him. When given the chance to speak, Jake blamed his actions on desperation and claimed he'd planned to pay everyone back once he got on his feet. He never apologized, never acknowledged the trust he'd broken or the families he'd violated. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison for interstate theft and identity fraud. Justice felt hollow sitting in that courtroom. We'd recovered a fraction of our stolen belongings, and Jake would eventually be released to start the cycle again with new victims. But as we walked out of the courthouse that day, I realized something important. The real work of healing wasn't going to happen in a courtroom or through the criminal justice system. It was going to happen at home, where we'd have to rebuild everything Jake had broken. The locksmith arrived Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. Jessica had called 3 different companies the night before asking for emergency service. We couldn't spend another night in a house where Jake had copies of our keys hidden somewhere or given to accomplices we didn't know about. The locksmith was a heavy-set man named Carl who'd been changing locks for 30 years. "House guest gone bad?" he asked while examining our front door. Apparently we weren't his first customers dealing with betrayal theft. Carl installed deadbolts on every exterior door and added window locks to the first floor. "Most people don't think about securing interior doors," he explained while working. "But if someone gets inside your house, you want safe spaces you can retreat to." Each upgrade felt like armor against future violations of our trust. Dr. Patricia Reeves specialized in trauma counseling for crime victims. She worked out of a small office downtown, with comfortable chairs and boxes of tissues strategically placed around the room. Betrayal by trusted friends creates a specific type of psychological wound, she explained during our first session. You're not just processing the loss of possessions, you're grieving the death of a relationship and questioning your ability to judge character. Jessica cried during that first appointment, something she'd been holding back for weeks. Our approach to helping others shifted completely. When Jessica's coworker mentioned her brother needed a place to stay after losing his apartment, we offered to help him find resources instead of opening our home. I connected him with transitional housing programs and job placement services, but we didn't invite him for dinner or offer our spare room. We still volunteered at the Children's Hospital and coached Little League, but we passed on hosting guests. The caution felt uncomfortable at first, like we were becoming the kind of people who'd rather write checks than get personally involved. News of Jake's betrayal spread through our neighborhood and the response surprised us. Mrs. Chen from next door brought us homemade soup and stayed for an hour listening to our story. The Hendersons across the street offered to keep watch when we traveled. People we'd barely spoken to before knocked on our door with offers of help and expressions of outrage on our behalf. 6 months after Jake's arrest, we started volunteering at a victim support center downtown, facilitating support groups for people who'd been victimized by people they trusted. The stories were heartbreakingly similar, but helping others process their trauma helped us process our own. Jessica and I found ourselves talking more honestly than we had in years. Late-night conversations about our fears, our mistakes, and our hopes replaced the routine discussions about schedules and household tasks that had dominated our marriage. "I'm proud of how we handled this together," Jessica said one evening while we sat on our back porch. "We could have turned on each other or blamed each other for trusting Jake. Instead, we became stronger." The crisis had forced us to rely on each other in ways we hadn't needed to before. Our children adapted to the situation better than we'd expected. Emma stopped asking about Uncle Jake after we explained that some adults make bad choices and hurt people who try to help them. Our teenage son Michael used Jake's betrayal as a research topic for a school project about white-collar crime. Our middle child asked thoughtful questions about how to know when someone is lying and whether it's safe to trust new people. We turned Jake's deception into teachable moments about setting boundaries and recognizing manipulation. I started running background checks on anyone we hired for home repairs or services. The process felt paranoid but necessary. We created a filing system for important documents and installed a fireproof safe for irreplaceable items. Jessica moved her jewelry to a safety deposit box at the bank. We developed protocols for house guests that included time limits, written agreements, and restricted access to certain areas of our home. We learned to distinguish between healthy caution and cynical withdrawal. Yes, we became more careful about who we allowed into our lives and our home. But we refused to let Jake's betrayal turn us into suspicious people who saw threats everywhere. Our family emerged from the crisis more united and more aware of our own resilience. Jake had stolen our possessions and violated our trust, but he'd failed to break our capacity for genuine connection with people who deserved it. The experience taught us something profound about human nature. When people face desperate circumstances, their true character emerges stripped of all pretense and social masks. Jake's desperation revealed exactly who he'd always been underneath the friendly mask. When faced with rebuilding his life through honest work and gradual progress, he chose instead to destroy 20 years of friendship for quick cash. That choice showed his true character more clearly than 2 decades of performed loyalty ever could. Jessica and I learned that betrayal by people we love cuts deeper than any stranger's crime, but it cannot break a family built on genuine foundations. Our marriage grew stronger. Our children learned valuable lessons about trust and boundaries, and we discovered resilience we didn't know we possessed. Set clear boundaries and keep backups of important documents, but never let one person's betrayal convince you that everyone will disappoint you. If you've experienced betrayal by someone you trusted, share your story in the comments below. We emerge stronger than ever, and you can too.